Because there are 8 students already. So yes, we can start. Why not? We can start.
Okay, sure. So thank you, Professor Mehrotra and Ankit, for having me here today. So the topic really of today's lecture would be Quad and international organizations. It's an interesting topic because this is a question that keeps popping up. What is the Quad? Whether Quad is an international organization, whether it's a partnership, whether it's something like an Asian NATO, or whether it's just foam in the ocean, like some people would like to call it. So we'll be discussing that today.
Ms. Jyotsna, just sorry to intervene. Since this will be recorded and also uploaded on YouTube, so I hope that's fine for you.
That's fine. I'm speaking here on my personal capacity and as a South Asian Voices visiting fellow. So that's fine.
Great. Just give me a minute to introduce you to the students.
Sure.
Ms. Jyotsna Mehra is a South Asian Voice Visiting Fellow at Stimson Center, Washington. Her research focuses on Indian foreign policy in the Indo-Pacific. She's a Pacific Young Forum leader and has done her MSc in Modern South Asian Studies from University of Oxford and BSc in Politics and International Relations from University of Manchester. It's a pleasure to have you, and the floor is to you now.
Thank you, Professor. It's nice being here. So basically we'll be covering a few topics that lead us to the question of whether the Quad is an international organization. Where does it stand in that framework of international organizations? So first we'll be touching the basics of what you need to qualify as an international organization. Then we'll go on to discussing whether the Quad really fits there. And then we'll be going through the peculiarities of Quad's history that have shaped its identity as an informal partnership as opposed to a formal organization. Then we'll be discussing the more sort of recent journey of the Quad towards a degree of formalization or institutionalization. And then we can talk about the Quad's relationship with other international organizations. And finally, we'll discuss whether there even is a need for the Quad to be formalized. So when you look at international organizations, there are a few basic ingredients that you need. You would need a secretariat or a headquarters. So ASEAN has one in Jakarta, Indonesia. The European Union has one in Brussels. You need that whole range of bureaucracy to support the everyday workings of an international organization and its many different branches. To run a secretariat, you also need a budget. So both the examples that I just gave, the ASEAN and an EU have huge budgets that get revised every year. Some organizations or groups like the BRICS might not have a secretariat, but they would have a rotating presidency system where the president incurs the cost of running that group for that year for hosting the summit. So for example, BRICS is currently being presided by India, so we'll be hosting the summit, in fact, next week. Then comes the question of treaty or binding agreements. So NATO comes to mind, which was formed on the basis of a treaty. A treaty or such a legally binding agreement sets the criteria for membership. It sets the mandate for that organization, what is it supposed to do, what it is not supposed to do, and also the need for such an organization. Then comes the question of political understanding. So you might not have a secretariat, you might not have a budget, and you might not even have a legally binding treaty. But you could be, for example, a G4, a G15, a G7, G20, G77, and so forth. So you're dealing with issues relevant to a particular group of countries. These could be developed or developing countries, liberal democracies. So you come to an understanding that we need to come together and discuss these issues as developed countries or developing countries. So now, where does the Quad stand? It does not have a secretariat or a headquarters. It does not have a consolidated budget. It does not have a legally binding treaty or an instrument. And even if when we come to the question of political understanding, the US, Japan, and Australia are allies, but India is wary of the alliance system. So does that mean that the Quad is not important? Just recently, we heard from the US Senior Director for East Asia and Oceania that the Quad is not important because it doesn't even have a letterhead. So the Quad, many would say, is going towards, it's still trying to figure out what it really is. And that, in many ways, is defined by its history, which we'll be going through shortly. So until recently, the Quad countries were even hesitant to call themselves the Quad because that gives the group a semblance of, that gives the four a semblance of a jointed group. So they would much rather prefer calling themselves India, Australia, Japan, and the US instead of a single group, the Quad. Here we have a few screenshots from very recent ones, in fact. So on your top left, you have a screenshot from the Ministry of External Affairs in India, which refrains from calling the group the Quad. This is from 2020 December. Then on the right, you have Australian DFAT, which calls the group the Quad. And then here you have the State Department, the US Embassy in India, again referring to the group as the Quad. This is from 2019. And then here, towards the very end, you have Japan again preferring to calling the group Japan, Australia, India, US instead of the Quad. There are reasons for this sort of reticence, which we will be discussing shortly. But after December 2020, the screenshots that we just saw, here we are, March 2021, a leader summit takes place. Not only the four countries reaffirm their commitment to the Quad, they in fact do that through a co-authored piece written by President Biden, Prime Minister Modi, Prime Minister Morrison, and Prime Minister Suga in Washington Post. And here they reaffirm their commitment to the Indo-Pacific and the Quad. So something has changed in this period, or we were in fact just going towards this period of change. So the Quad's roots really lie in December 2004, when our region was hit by the Indian Ocean tsunami. India, Japan, Australia, and the US formed the Tsunami Core Group that saw them pooling their HADR capabilities and contributing more than 40,000 troops and responders, rescue planes, and ships in a joint operation to respond to the tsunami. 3 years later, in Manila, along the sidelines of the ASEAN Regional Forum, senior officials of the Quad met. This was the first such meeting. And then the Quad, together with Singapore, the Squad, took part in the Malabar exercise in the Bay of Bengal in 2007. The Malabar exercises initially just involved the US and India, and then Japan was invited, and finally, the last Quad partner, Australia, was invited in 2007. But observers at the time were already seeing the Quad as an axis of democracies set to contain a rising China. Alarmist readings of the Quad had already dubbed it as an Asian NATO, and this started making the Quad countries a little bit uncomfortable because they wanted to have sound relations with the rising power that China was at the time. You would see that Quad leaders and officials went out of their way to distance the group from perceptions of being an anti-Beijing alliance. Australian officials, for example, at the time, clearly ruled out that the group was a security alliance. They downplayed their ASEAN Regional Forum meeting as a mere manifestation of a brewing natural partnership between countries who share some binding values without really defining what those binding values were. And that these officials highlighted that the focus of the group was really on non-controversial issues like disaster management. And in fact, even on the Malabar, you saw that the official press readings at the time said that the focus was on terrorism, on nuclear proliferation, natural disasters, spread of pandemics, even during that time. So what they were really trying to do was steer clear from perceptions of a threat coming from a certain state, China in this regard. They were also increasing internal political resistance in some countries. In India, for example, the Communist Party of India um, was wary of India's growing proximity with the United States and its perceived belligerence towards China. And there was also growing discomfort in Australia at the time because Australia was seeing that China was replacing Japan as its top trade partner, the largest buyer of Australian goods. So PM John Howard's defense minister, for example, reassured China that Australia was not interested in pursuing a QUAD partnership with India, just weeks after the QUAD first met in 2007. And then we had the infamous Kevin Rudd incident, when Kevin Rudd happens to be the first Mandarin-speaking prime minister of a Western country. So his foreign minister, Stephen Smith, announced Australia's withdrawal from the QUAD during a joint press briefing with the Chinese foreign minister in Canberra. This is when the QUAD, in fact, the QUAD in its first phase ended. And in India, Manmohan Singh's government was facing backlash for the US civil nuclear deal, and India-Japan and India-Australia ties remained underexplored at the time. And the US was also more interested in pursuing a US-Australia-Japan trilateral rather than the quadrilateral partnership. And really what was, what really hit the QUAD again was Prime Minister Shinzo Abe of Japan, his resignation in 2007. He was one of the chief architects of the QUAD and later of the Indo-Pacific concept. So what we were seeing was that there was what started happening was that countries became cautious about jeopardizing their ties with China, but this started fueling suspicions about their other QUAD partners' reliability in pursuing a relationship to counterbalance China. So both these factors started reinforcing each other. So the countries were hesitant to damage ties with the economic giant that is China. So they distanced themselves from the QUAD or projected QUAD as a harmless non-security alliance, and this created suspicions about reliability of their partners, further adding to the costs of going alone to fight the problem of an assertive rising China. But things started changing since then, since 2008. In 2013, 2014, Xi Jinping came to power in China and the Belt and Road Initiative was launched. This is when we started hearing a lot more about debt traps and China building artificial islands in the South China Sea. This is also when Chinese behavior finally began fueling domestic concerns in all four countries, bringing them ever closer together. So in Australia, it was trade dependency on China. When Kevin Rudd pulled the plug on the QUAD, they wanted to pursue a relationship with China built on trade. But now Australia was worried that China was weaponizing that leverage that it had over Canberra. China was also increasingly exercising a lot of influence in Australia and its neighborhood in the South Pacific. And Australia was increasingly being targeted. In fact, very recently were cyber attacks coming from state actors, largely believed to be China. And India, of course, started seeing that China was acquiring footing in its strategic locations across South Asia and in the Indian Ocean region. We were seeing border tensions with China in 2013 in Depsang, Doklam in 2017, and finally Galwan in 2020, 2021. Japan at this time was thinking of reforming its pacifist constitution as it started facing security challenges from Beijing in the East China Sea, where the Senkaku Island dispute lies. And the US was seeing that its focus was shifting towards the Indo-Pacific, where really the strategic competition with China over the rules-based order lay. And this was also the time when intra-Quad relations began improving remarkably, facilitating this rebirth of the Quad. So defense cooperation across trilaterals and bilaterals started improving. This was the time when India finalized logistics sharing agreements with all 4 countries. These agreements are important as a basis of further defense cooperation and interoperability between the militaries of these 4 countries. And there was a reset in India's defense ties with the other 3 members of the Quad. We established 2+2 foreign and defense dialogues with all Quad countries. One could argue that this was also a time when the Quad and just generally the concept of Indo-Pacific received more political backing from the Donald Trump administration in the US, Modi government here in India, the Liberal Party in Australia, first led by Malcolm Turnbull and then by Scott Morrison, and then finally the Liberal Democratic Party-led governments in Japan, which are perceived to be more bullish on foreign policy and on China. And then finally, the Quad started becoming routine after 2017. We started seeing more frequent senior official level meetings, biannual ministerial meetings, and Australia was finally invited back to the Quad after a gap of 13 years in 2020 to participate in the Malabar drills. And then finally this year, we saw the Quad leaders meeting. This was the first ever such leaders level summit of the Quad. And like I mentioned earlier, this was when the 4 explicitly embraced their partnership, and they released a joint statement for the first time on the spirit of the Quad and co-authored a piece in the Washington Post. This is from the Leaders Summit. An interesting development that we saw during the Leaders Summit was that the focus was shifting towards global issues. So Quad as an example of a group of capable democracies that can deliver. It appeared that they were setting themselves apart from China during a time when China had angered many because of the pandemic and because of opening various fronts of conflicts during the last 1 year. This focus on global issues while setting the Quad apart from apart from China also helped the Quad avoid perceptions of being that Asian NATO focused on China. So in a way, that ironic signaling helps the Quad stay because it avoids that perception of being a belligerent security alliance, but it also sets them apart from China. Having said that, maritime issues, South and East China Sea, because these issues remained quite hot during the year, territorial issues with India also found their place in the joint statement. So we're seeing that the Quad was moving towards some form of institutionalization, but what really was noteworthy during the Leaders Summit was that 3 working groups were formed, one on vaccine partnership, one on critical and emerging technology, and one on climate change. So for vaccines, the model that we adopted was that of division of labor or tapping niche capabilities. So we're relying on Indian manufacturing from Biological E Limited to manufacture 1 billion vaccine doses, including the one developed by Johnson & Johnson. These will be financed by a joint, will be financed through various agencies in the US and Japan. Japan would also be assisting developing countries in purchasing vaccines and strengthening their cold chain systems. And Australia would be assisting in logistics. So, and the Quad will be working with other international organizations such as WHO and COVAX. And again, we saw that the Quad Vaccine Experts Group was formed, which would draw scientists and officers from all 4 countries to institutionalize this cooperation on vaccines. So 3 things: division of labor, working with other organizations, and institutionalizing cooperation, pandemic cooperation. Then on emerging technologies, what we saw was that, again, we were working with other organizations in facilitating coordination on technology standards development, including liaising between national technology standards bodies and international actors. We also saw the four, again, institutionalize their tech cooperation by drawing officers who would develop a statement of principles and standards, who would monitor trends and opportunities in emerging technologies, and convene dialogues on critical technology supply chains and 5G. On climate change, a similar story, but climate change remains one of those areas where I think there'll be limits to how much we can cooperate within the Quad, because on policy, all four of us are widely apart. But the focus would be to work together on implementation of Paris Agreement, climate technology development, and working together with other countries on capacity building, climate finance, and climate tech. But this institutionalization goes beyond these three working groups. We're already seeing that it looks that the Malabar is getting routinized or institutionalized with the Quad, with Australia again participating in the 2021 version of the exercise. This is second year in a row for the first time that all four Quad countries are doing Malabar together, and it in fact began quite recently off the coast of Guam in Western Pacific. And this time the exercises are quite complex, involving anti-surface, anti-air, anti-submarine warfare. So when it comes to the Quad's relationship with other international organizations, one thing that clearly stands out is that in the Indo-Pacific visions of all four countries, these countries specify that they will work with ASEAN, and they recognize that ASEAN is central to the story of Indo-Pacific, because this is where the competition really lies along the Malacca Straits, South China Sea. So it'll be important that they work with ASEAN. However, I can already see challenges with that, because ASEAN might not be, all ASEAN countries are not on the same page when it comes to the Indo-Pacific. Like I already pointed out, on pandemic cooperation, the Quad is already working with WHO and COVAX in not only getting the vaccines approved, but also on delivering these vaccines that are made here in India through financing of other Quad partners to other developing countries. On climate change and blue economy, I think that the Quad could work with Indian Oceans Commission, which is a group which is focused around Indian Ocean islands in the southwestern Indian Ocean. We could work with Pacific Islands Forum, we could work with BIMSTEC, and we could work with Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative. When we look at maritime security, we could work with Indian Ocean Naval Symposium, again with Indian Ocean Commission, Indian Ocean Rim Association, and the D10, which is the Democracy 10. On technology, again, Democracy 10, and certain organizations which are key when it comes to technology standards and where China has a great amount of clout. All Quad countries could be, once they develop a statement of principles on technology standards, could use their own clout to lobby here in these organizations to oppose Chinese imposition of their technology standards. I think the model that we could use to work with the different organizations would be quite fluid. So for example, we don't have to work with all D10 countries, but some like the UK, France, maybe even Korea. So now we revisit the slide where we spoke about how the Quad might not fulfill the credentials of being an international organization, does not have a secretariat, budget, a legally binding treaty, or even full political understanding. But then, is that even desired? What we've seen is that the Quad's agenda has evolved over time. The Quad not being a rigid organization has allowed it a little bit of fluidity and flexibility to allow its agenda to develop. It has allowed the Quad to figure out areas of misalignment and alignment and to work those out. It has allowed the Quad not to be limited to a box and for its area of cooperation to be limited to a certain area. We've seen how bureaucracy may in fact be limiting for international organizations. I just gave an example of the ASEAN, which has not really been on the same page when it comes to issues like Myanmar or even Indo-Pacific. And that comes from the fact that the ASEAN is it's a larger organization. It has its own systems, and it might not be as easy because the focus is a lot on the form of the group, the structure of the group, and not the function of the group. So for the Quad to focus on the function instead of the form has been one of its plus points, where the Quad has delivered despite not being an organization per se. One of the points that would be interesting here to note is that not being an organization allows the Quad to work while avoiding the triggering of a 2008-like scenario where everyone started calling it an alliance, an Asian NATO, and the Quad countries developed cold feet and backtracked from the idea of collaborating further. So while we are still figuring out and ironing out our differences with the other three countries, I think it's a good idea to let things develop as they are in a more sort of flexible manner. We're already seeing the U.S. alliance system taking a blow from what happened in Afghanistan. So now, sort of limiting ourselves to working with the United States in an organization as important as the Quad might not be the best option for us. So to have sort of our options open, to be able to participate with the Quad countries while aligning also with other countries like France and United Kingdom, we should have those options open, and limiting ourselves through a bureaucratic Quad structure might not be in our interest. And but we're already seeing institutionalization and operationalization within set focus areas like the three that we discussed: vaccines, technology, and climate change. So as and when issue areas develop and we're able to iron out our differences, we are already formalizing them. So we're seeing issue-based institutionalization within the Quad already take shape. So then we come back to the question of whether the Quad should be institutionalized, or should it be allowed to develop more organically and we take it from there. That would be it.
Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. Perhaps institutionalization would also mean that you establish a NATO Article 5, and perhaps if there's Chinese aggression, then it goes against all. That's just thinking out loud, I hope. I do acknowledge Professor Popovski, who's also joined us. Professor, would you like to say a few words?
Yes, thank you very much, Jyotsna. I am sorry that I joined late and couldn't hear the beginning of your talk, but I'm very aware of your activities. And let me say that it very much coincides with something I have been thinking and writing about, which was published last summer, exactly a year ago, also, by the way, with the Stimson Center in Washington, the idea for multiple security councils created by the General Assembly under Article 22. So I hope later Ankit can share with you my paper on how do I see the reform of the United Nations, in specifics the idea that the current Security Council doesn't engage successfully and efficiently with the issues such as pandemics, climate change, peace building activities, and other organs hopefully can take that burden out of the shoulders of the Security Council, which can remain as obsolete and anachronistic as it is, and dealing with sanctions and use of force. But those issues which we see as, I will say, even much more important than the traditional peace and security issues. Much more people suffer from pandemics and climate change rather than from armed conflict. It's no longer the end of the Second World War where the best minds were preoccupied with peace and security. Today, the challenges have shifted and people suffer from extreme weather events, floodings, fires, and pandemics. So then, and also adding to that, the fact that the Security Council has not been reformed since 1960s. The idea is whether the General Assembly can create a Peace-Building Council, Health Security Council, and Climate Change Council, somehow additional bodies to challenge the existing Security Council, but also I would say to help the existing Security Council, not to be burdened with those issues rather than those to be taken in a slightly different form. Of course, the P5 can be in all of those. They don't lose any powers, by the way. The P5 can attend all 3 new councils. But those will have a larger membership and more stakeholders, including international financial institutions, including donors, private sector, and so on. So thank you, Jyotsna. Your presentation was excellent, as always. I know you by name from your association with the Stimson Center, but pleasure to meet you, although virtually today. Hopefully next time we can meet in person. Please welcome to visit us in Jindal University one day when the travel resumes. We'll be very happy to host you. I will delegate the question and answer session to my colleagues, but I will stay definitely and I will listen with attention until the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Popovski. It's really, really nice hearing from you. And Ankit just shared the article with me, so I know what I'm reading tonight. Thank you.
Well, let me just pose the first question to you on the model because it somehow ties exactly with what you were talking about, and not in so many words as what Professor uses, but it strikes a chord very, very aptly, and it perhaps shows that what Professor Popovski is suggesting is already in work. Because the key tenets which you refer to were division of labor, institutional support, and some sort of a working modus operandi without perhaps rubbing someone the wrong way. So, in that sense, what remains your opinion of perhaps enlarging this into a global sphere as opposed to not only limiting it to Asia?
So the focus is on Indo-Pacific because I think what has really helped the revival of the Quad has been the interest in the Indo-Pacific, because this is the area where most of the world lives. This is the area where most of the world's conflicts are. This is also the area where the global economic weight has shifted. So of course, the key focus would remain in this area, because this is also where all the 4 countries are situated. We form a quadrilateral around the Indo-Pacific area. But also, you're seeing that we're cooperating in various different permutation combinations with our partners elsewhere. So Africa comes to mind, where the focus, although remains on East Africa, but we have what is called the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, where we're working with Japan. But increasingly, you're also hearing from countries in Latin America who are interested in the concept of the Indo-Pacific. A lot of the times, what you feel is that the Indo-Pacific might not just be a geographical location, but also a whole collection of what is understood as the era of strategic competition between China and the West, and preserving a sort of a multilateral order, a multipolar order in Asia, but the stability of the Indo-Pacific would remain important to that question. But yeah, I think the focus would remain here for it to be more effective.
But just to have a small discussion and to shift the area to, let's say, Afghanistan, where the conflict really seems about going back to the Cold War era / the era of physical fighting. So does the focus then shift again to what Professor was suggesting now, going back to a more physical and a more hand-to-hand combat sort of fighting, is that going to be, is that an area where the Quad perhaps might be more useful? Because at least for the Americans, Americans in themselves remain unsure as to who their allies really are. So having a strategic partnership in the region perhaps might be helpful, although not exactly in the region, but thereabouts.
Yeah, so say Afghanistan is a good example of why there are voices in Delhi and elsewhere which are resistant to the idea of institutionalizing the Quad, because there are certain things that we've been talking about when it comes to Afghanistan for years now, and it feels like they haven't been really adhered to. So, for example, where does the Taliban draw its support from? When it so why did we build the Chabahar port? Why? I think no. So when it comes to Afghanistan, we'll have to separate that issue from the strategic competition in the Indo-Pacific. We will have to the like you said, the era of hand-to-hand combat and competition, it might suit the story of Afghanistan, and we'll have to strengthen our own defense systems to deal with the problem. But when it comes to Indo-Pacific, I think we're having very 21st century challenges here when it comes to cyber warfare standards, drones, and all sorts of things that we have to work together with our partners on.
Well, let's shift the battle again to the oceans, and I do invite Professor Mehrotra also to ask a question after this. But just one question which I was interested in understanding was, even in the Quad, the lowest common denominator perhaps one could chart back to is the United Kingdom. And the United Kingdom, well, I refer to the example in the sense of a colonial rule. But the point that I want to make is that having an island or having some sort of a physical base in the region was, at least in a strategic sense, quite useful. But we've seen how things have unfolded in the Chagosian archipelago. So if that is what remains of the empire, and looking at it from a strategic perspective, how big a loss is it actually for strategic reasons, losing a military base in a region which is extremely crucial? Because
So
the South China Sea is really fallen, and now it's really the sort of Indian belt which remains the next focus point.
yeah, but on the Chago story, so on one hand you'll see India resisting the on the grounds that you highlighted, as a former colony, resisting the idea of the UK having a base here, and US using it as Diego Garcia. But also, it is an Indian interest for the United States to be present in the Indian Ocean, although Indian Ocean really falls, under. India considers that India is the net security provider in the region, but it helps to have friends in the region. Having said that, I think on more public forums, India would continue to oppose any vestiges of a colonial history in the region.
And to support that, you have already heard Shago saying that we do want to tie with the US. So they do understand the strategic perspective of this as well. I now invite Professor Mehrotra to share his question, please.
Thank you, Ankit. I just had one question, since your focus is on India's foreign policy. So how do you see Quad contributing to India's foreign policy? That is the aspect of dual policy, when it gets associated with developed countries, but at the same time represents itself as the leader or as the representative of the developing countries, where forums like SARC come into place. So how do you see Quad contributing to that policy, or does it make an exception?
I think it fits well into that perception of that dual policy that you just highlighted. I remember Minister Jaishankar once mentioning a word that we are now moving towards being a southwestern power, where we have strong alliances with the West, but we're very much a part of the global South. So in sort of aligning, small a aligning with countries like US and Australia and Japan, we see ourselves as a part of that sort of D10 or Quad system of powers, which are predominantly Western powers. But a lot of our focus area would still remain the global South. Um, if we just look at the idea of the vaccine partnership, for example, India would be manufacturing these vaccines for its supply to the global South. So I am seeing that the focus is shifting on provision of global goods or tackling global issues, where the global South really takes the largest share of the pie, where providing HADR, the Quad coming together to provide HADR. The focus is again on the global South. If we go back to the time when we cooperated during the 2007 2004 tsunami. The focus was on the global South, Indian Ocean islands, and littoral countries. And again, now we're seeing that the focus is on providing public goods to countries in the Indo-Pacific, developing countries in the Indo-Pacific, but it is being provided by 3 developed countries and 1 developing country, that is India.
And just a question which is quite rhetorical but keeps on coming, the impact of India, the impact of strained relations with its neighbors like Pakistan in the long term, like how do you see this getting to a solution or amicable settlement so that the other priority measures, other priority areas are looked into more?
I think when it comes to Pakistan, India's position is quite clear that terrorism and cooperation cannot go hand in hand. So I think the onus really lies on Pakistan here, for it to give up its obsession over cutting short India's rise in a way. So and when it comes to the Quad, really, I think the issue of Pakistan would be interesting to note in the months and years to come, when it comes to the Afghan-Pakistan scenario. How does the relationship between the United States and Pakistan develop? Will the US again be sort of we've seen the NSA of Pakistan in a way threaten the United States with another 9/11 if Pakistan and the Taliban are not helped financially to counter terrorism coming from other terrorist organizations. So we'll have to see how that relationship develops with the US, how Pakistan-US relations develop, for it to have any fundamental impact on the Quad. Because the Quad's focus area, I think, lie more on the maritime sphere and on provision of global public goods, like I said. But yeah, I think Bangladesh would be an important partner for us when it comes to these 4 countries operating in the region. So would be Sri Lanka, Maldives. Pakistan would obviously stand out because, again, Pakistan is China has a lot of clout in Pakistan for it to take real independent foreign policy decisions on this.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
But perhaps the Quad shift in terms of its focus region might be something which might be on the cards, because this is an organization which has some sort of potency to it, and it might also reinforce some sort of evolution, or if not evolution, in terms of its acts towards improving the status quo in Afghanistan. Seeing how events have unfolded in Afghanistan, do you envisage something happening in terms of the shift of focus for Quad or addition of focus?
Um, it's I think it's very complicated for the Quad to to get involved in Afghanistan. The US has already left Afghanistan and does not want anything to do with it. Japan, Australia, I don't think they're as concerned about Afghanistan as much as we would be, because it's in our neighborhood and there are direct security consequences for us. So I think the max that I can see for us to emerge out of this would be sort of diplomatic support when it comes to terrorism in the region. We'll see the four countries perhaps lobbying more closely when in international organizations on certain terrorist groups, on listing, on sanctions on terror groups. We'll be seeing perhaps more counterterrorism exercises. But in Afghanistan, we could see we might just be on our own in terms of, again, carrying out development work or humanitarian work. I don't really see the Quad thinking about this as much. They'll be discussing the issue. They'll be coordinating policy, but I don't think that the focus would shift towards Afghanistan.
I was also curious to know about, you did highlight this in your presentation, but if you could shed some more light on why institutionalization, when it at least happened initially or was envisaged initially as being a NATO of Asia, why was there apprehension amongst the states to accede to that? Was it the uh, reputation or of the NATO being rather infamous because of its other adventures, or were it other reasons or commitment essentially a reason why there was initial apprehension?
So we were not seeing institutionalization per se. What we were seeing was perceptions of the Quad going towards institutionalization, and that had already started cautioning the Quad countries, and not because the NATO has a history of being infamous or anything like that. It was so because what was so the people who wanted the Quad to fail in a way, it could be writing for Global Times or People's Daily, were calling it Asian NATO because that was giving that was making the Quad countries uncomfortable because they wanted to have a stable relationship with China, because we're no longer in the Cold War era where we can completely delink ourselves from each other. So our economies are integrated. So we have to sort of work a way out where we're able to counterbalance our adversary while still maintaining a level of cooperation with them, level of trade ties with them, because it's just not possible to do that anymore, where we can completely cut ourselves off. So these countries were mindful at the time of that reality of China's rise, of its clout as an economic giant. However, now we've seen that these countries have started delinking their economies a little bit with that of China. They've started delinking also sort of their internet from that of China. We're hearing a lot about splinternet. A lot of this has actually just come from China itself because it has its own rules and regulations. But there are still certain areas where you'll have to work with China, climate change being one of them. So because we cannot completely, cut ourselves off from China, we have to maintain that level of working relationship. I think was the reason why people started getting cold feet because of perceptions of it being the security alliance. In India, just generally, we don't like being in alliances. So I think that itself was enough for us.
And India's isolationist in terms of allying itself to any group goes back to the days of NAM. So there remain remnants of that experience as well. But one thing I really appreciated in the presentation was the acceleration of Quad and its importance at the beginning of the Xi Jinping era, which really sees noticeable change in the Chinese foreign policy and advancements in the South China Sea. So, in that sense, is the Quad really a counter to the Chinese expansion, or is it in itself also got some sort of a importance as not being just a countervailing force?
So I would just take it from where I just left your last question. I would say that the Quad sort of took a birth again as a result of Chinese behavior, because the external environment was such that we started seeing concerns being voiced in all four countries regarding sort of the maritime part of the things, South China Sea, East China Sea, Indian Ocean region, the Belt and Road Initiative, death trap diplomacy, gray zone warfare in the region, and we started hearing about cyber attacks, and increasingly also this wolf warrior diplomacy started taking shape. We started hearing about concerns around Huawei and 5G. So all this sort of fueling a more convergences between the four Quad countries, bringing them together. Because when they had first started convening in 2007, they didn't really have very defined interests, shared interests. They knew that there are four democracies and China is a potential competitor. But in that intervening period between 2008 and 2017, a lot changed in the external environment, and that had its ramifications for the rebirth of the Quad.
And I think perhaps this can also be drawn to, let's say, the BRICS, which really doesn't have anything substantial in terms of its preamble or operational framework. Right. I don't see any questions, and
May I say a few words?
so
I'm also interested in kind of the larger cooperation between China and India, not simply within the Asian continent, but in the United Nations, in BRICS, in G20, and somehow, as someone not from India, I would probably express the willingness of many around the world, including small countries like mine, to see the future big powers like China and India in a more cooperative relationship. When discussions were held about new members of the Security Council, for example, India, Japan, Brazil, South Africa, Germany, applied to be permanent members. One question raised by many member states in the United Nations was whether the new members will behave like the old members. In other words, if they continue to do what the Americans, Russians, and Chinese do, then why do we need to expand the membership? If South Africa, Brazil, India do exactly kind of policies that are unilateral, very much focused on national interest, narrowly defined, which were the problems with the Security Council, old members, which were very much thinking only about their own national interest, the Russian and Chinese and Americans. When they discuss any issue in the Security Council, it is very much about what very selfishly they think about it, rather than to reflect the willingness of the rest of the world. By the way, Article 24 of the UN Charter demands the Security Council to act on behalf of the member states. And I know it will take time to develop a truly multilateral system. And for that matter, any initiative, regional initiative, could be calibrated against that expectations for new hegemons, regional hegemons like India, to act on behalf of larger region, not just their national interest. So it's simply, it's not a question. I'm kind of trying to share an expectation that powers will shift over the next 20 or even less 10 years. And the new big players in the global affairs in international law are expected to be examples of multilateralism. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
I don't know whether I made myself clear what I was trying to say, but anyway, go ahead if you want to get more questions. Ankit, is there anybody waiting in the chat room for in the conversation?
Professor Mehrotra, would you like to?
Yeah, just to extend what Professor Popovski mentioned, discussed about. So, Ms. Jyotsna, do you feel that India and China's bilateral relations, though deriving from a common root, that they were both developing countries trying to represent the global South, and whether we go back to 1955 Bandung Conference, but at this time, like because of the territorial disputes and China alleging India that USA and India are conspiring against them. So what do you think would be the way ahead, keeping in line with what Professor Popovski said, that relations get reinvigorated because it assumes great significance for the future, and as they are the global powers, and India is also on the track of becoming such in next 20 or 30 years?
Yeah, I agree that it'll be hard to not work with China at all. There will be areas where we will have to cooperate with them, climate change being one of those key areas. Um, but what we're hearing from the Indian government is that as long as China continues to um, foment trouble along the borders, the nature of the entire relationship will get affected. And that will limit cooperation, at least in the short term, for us with the Chinese. But in the longer term, I simply cannot see how we will not find areas to cooperate on, because these are two large countries. They form um, huge portions of the world's population and economy. So it's just impossible for us to not work with each other.
Thank you.
Let me also share that the Bandung Conference is also the birthplace of the 12 movement, which is essentially seeking a third world perspective on international law. So there are vestiges of international law taking place from conferences such as these, and perhaps it also highlights the importance of a movement starting from the South Asian region and also having global impact. With those words, I invite Ms. Mehra to now share final words and thoughts, and then we can close.
Again, I would just like to say that China as an actor in the multilateral sphere would also be, it's something that demands more scrutiny, because we see how China operates in other countries through kickbacks, through developing sort of relationships with the elite in those countries and working its way through. So whether China really is like an ideal sort of role model when it comes to an actor in the globe, in the multilateral sphere, still remains quite doubtful. And India's way of operation, at least how we like to highlight, is it is quite different. So, for example, as a development partner, we say that we would like to work with countries in Africa and elsewhere, and we would like to act according to what their demands are and what their needs are, and we would like to sort of we would like to impart training and skills to local workforces instead of flying in our own workforces over there. So the ways these two countries operate is also quite different. And that's, I think, where the friction would lie when it comes to our how both these countries work together in the multilateral order, because this again would form two separate sorts of spheres within that order.
Let me add a few words here. I absolutely agree with that. And let me just give you a comparison here if you want. Back in, well, let's say 20 years ago, we discussed this as a part of a book project in Europe regarding minorities and whether what we call kin state can try to protect its minorities abroad in neighboring country. And well, the case study was Hungary. There are many Hungarians living outside Hungary in the neighboring country, Romania, Slovakia, Ukraine, Austria. And there has been an attempt by the Hungarian foreign policy and governments over time to take action in protection of those minorities, even issuing some special treatment, passports, and so on. And that generally deteriorated the relationship with the neighboring country. We wrote a book about this, by the way. It's called Blood and Borders in 2011, trying to summarize that phenomena of effectively, the message from the book was that, yes, states, kin states, can do that, but only through regional organizations such as the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, or through the Council of Europe, or later through the European Union. And I just want to give that parallel here that it would be, back to China and India, I guess it would be a better model if not India simply take, well, I guess India unilaterally can also criticize China for human rights and Uyghur population and so on. But if regional organizations such as QUAD, SAARC and others play that role, because that will keep the purely bilateral relationship between India and China safer, so to speak, from those interventions. In other words, when I mentioned in my previous intervention multilateralism, I also mean not only global multilateralism, but also regional multilateralism. In other words, it would be kind of a division of labor, if you want, if multilateral, regional, and global institutions take a firm role on China, violations of international law, human rights, and so on, so that the bilateral relations of specific countries, and it's not only India, but also other affected countries, probably the Philippines, or Vietnam, and other neighbors of China, do not need to worry about possible countermeasures, if you want. That's why I see, as I mentioned, a division of labor. The critical voices should be as multilateral as possible so that the bilateral relations do not need to do that and be deteriorated. But thank you, Jyotsna. It was an amazing conversation. I wish more students could ask questions today. I'm aware that some of them still need to finish a paper, which unfortunately today was the deadline for a paper they have to submit. So I kind of can understand why students were not very proactive in asking questions. But I hope they are there. They are in the room. They have listened. Was the lecture recorded, Ankit? I hope so. So if students would like to go, it was, yeah. So if the students want to go back to that, they can do that. So my warm thanks to our excellent speaker today, Jyotsna Mehra. We learn a lot. Actually, I haven't been much following the latest on QUAD, and it was very, very informative for me, including. And as I said in the beginning, let's hope we can continue our cooperation. Be welcome to India. I will be also working with Richard Ponzio is my contact in the Stimson Center. We did a lot together already, and we will continue to do a lot in the next years, mostly in terms of the project he's heading, renewal and innovation of global governance. So hopefully our paths will cross definitely in the future.
I certainly hope so, Professor. And thank you for sharing such fresh insights on multilateralism and on human rights coming from multilateral fora. That's something definitely that I think needs more exploration. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Jyotsna. It was a great learning for all of us, and thank you so much, and hopefully see you soon again.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thanks all.